You're standing in the cathedral, dressed in silk and jewels that weigh more than you do. The organ music thunders through stone arches while thousands of eyes watch you take each measured step toward the altar. Your hands shake beneath the bouquet of white roses, their thorns pricking through the fabric of your gloves, drawing blood that seeps into pristine white satin. You're 14 years old, and in moments you'll be married to a man you've never met, a man old enough to be your grandfather, whose reputation for cruelty has reached even your sheltered ears in the convent where they kept you hidden until today. The wedding dress, a masterpiece of French craftsmanship, feels like armor made of lace and pearls. Beneath it, your ribs are so tightly corseted you can barely breathe. Each step sends shooting pains through feet crushed into shoes too small because your mother insisted tiny feet were more becoming for a princess. The cathedral stretches endlessly before you, and you know that with each step, you're walking away from any hope of a normal life, any chance of love, any possibility of happiness. Behind you walks your father, his hand occasionally pressing against your back when you slow, a reminder that retreat is impossible. You've been sold, though they use prettier words like alliance and diplomatic necessity. The price was paid in territories and trade agreements, in promises of military support and dynastic legitimacy. You are the currency in which kingdoms trade, and your wedding day is simply the moment of transaction. Your future husband waits at the altar, and even from this distance, you can see the way younger courtiers shrink away from him. His previous wife died under mysterious circumstances just 6 months ago. Servants whisper about cries for help in the night, about symbols of suffering, about a body so mutilated the coffin had to remain closed. But no one investigates the death of a foreign princess when political stability is at stake. This is your wedding day, the day every little girl supposedly dreams about. But instead of joy, you feel only the cold certainty that you're walking toward your doom, that this cathedral aisle is the last path you'll ever walk as yourself. Tomorrow you'll wake up as property, and if you're lucky, you'll survive long enough to produce an heir. If you're not lucky, well, there's always another princess somewhere, another girl whose life can be traded for political advantage. The history of royal marriages reads like a catalog of horrors disguised as fairy tales. Behind the glittering ceremonies and magnificent gowns, behind the cheering crowds and elaborate festivities, existed a system that routinely sacrificed young women on the altar of political expediency. These weren't love matches or even arranged partnerships between equals. They were transactions in which girls barely past puberty were handed over to men who viewed them as breeding stock at best, disposable playthings at worst. Consider the fate of Agnes of France, married at age 8 to Andronikos Komnenos, heir to the Byzantine Empire. The marriage negotiations began when she was barely old enough to speak clearly, her future decided by men who saw her not as a child needing protection, but as a diplomatic tool to secure an alliance between East and West. She was sent from the French court to Constantinople at age 9, thrust into an alien culture where she didn't speak the language, didn't understand the customs, didn't know a single soul except the translators assigned to her. The Byzantine court records describe the wedding preparations with clinical detachment. The child bride was bathed in rose water and dressed in purple silk, the imperial color. Her hair, still bearing the soft texture of childhood, was woven with golden threads and pearls. Cosmetics were applied to make her appear older, though no amount of powder could disguise the fact that she was a little girl playing dress-up in an empress's robes. The wedding ceremony itself was a study in grotesque contrasts. Here was a child who should have been playing with dolls, standing beside a teenager who would one day become one of Byzantium's most violent rulers. The priests intoned their blessings while Agnes struggled to repeat Greek phrases she didn't understand. When the time came to exchange rings, her hands were so small that the imperial band had to be wrapped with silk threads to keep it from sliding off her finger. But the ceremony was merely the beginning of Agnes's ordeal. That night, she was prepared for the wedding bed by court ladies who understood their role in this sanctioned abuse. They dressed her in a nightgown of translucent silk, gently escorted her into the private chambers following tradition. What happened behind those closed doors isn't recorded in official histories, but we can imagine the terror of a 9-year-old child faced with the harsh expectations placed on a young bride by a society that disregarded consent in favor of custom and control. Agnes survived that night, and many nights that followed, though survival is perhaps too strong a word for the existence she endured. Palace servants reported that she would often be found hiding in alcoves and storage rooms, trying to make herself invisible when her husband's footsteps echoed through the corridors. She developed a stutter that worsened whenever Andronikos was present, her child's voice breaking over simple words as fear constricted her throat. The physical damage from these encounters was severe enough that court physicians were regularly summoned to treat injuries they carefully didn't document. Byzantine medical texts from the period describe treatments for female troubles that, when decoded, reveal a catalog of trauma inflicted on bodies too young to withstand adult sexuality. Agnes required special cushions to sit, walked with difficulty, and suffered from recurring infections that the primitive medicine of the time could barely address. But perhaps more devastating than the physical abuse was the complete isolation Agnes endured. Taken from everything familiar, she was surrounded by courtiers who saw her only as a political symbol. Her attempts to maintain contact with her French family were discouraged, then forbidden outright. Letters she wrote in her childish hand were intercepted and destroyed. She was not allowed French-speaking companions, forced instead to struggle with Greek while processing trauma that would have broken an adult. As Agnes grew older, the abuse evolved but never ceased. Andronikos, who would later murder his way to the throne, practiced his cruelty on his child bride. He would force her to watch as he tortured servants for minor infractions, telling her this was what happened to wives who displeased their husbands. He made her participate in elaborate humiliation rituals, public demonstrations of his power over her that the Byzantine court accepted as normal expressions of marital authority. By age 12, Agnes had reportedly made 2 desperate attempts to escape her fate, one involving a fall, another a mistaken potion, but turned out to be colored water. Both attempts resulted in increased restrictions on her movement and constant surveillance by guards who were ordered to keep the empress alive, but not necessarily unharmed. She existed in a gilded cage, valuable only for her potential to produce heirs and maintain the fiction of French-Byzantine alliance. The wedding that had been celebrated as a diplomatic triumph became a slow-motion tragedy that played out over years. Agnes aged rapidly, her child's face developing the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who has seen too much. Courtiers noted that she rarely smiled, rarely spoke above a whisper, moved through palace ceremonies like a ghost dilapidated in imperial purple. The little French princess who had arrived full of life gradually faded into a shadow of herself, broken by a system that saw her suffering as an acceptable price for political stability. But Agnes was far from unique in her suffering. Across Europe, young girls were routinely handed over to violent men in ceremonies blessed by church and state. The younger the bride, the more malleable she was assumed to be, the easier to mold into whatever role her husband required. These child marriages were so common that they shaped the entire structure of royal succession and international diplomacy. Consider Margaret Beaufort, married at age 12 to Edmund Tudor, a man in his mid-20s who saw his child bride solely as a means to produce an heir. The marriage was consummated immediately, despite Margaret's obvious physical immaturity. Within a year, she was pregnant, her 12-year-old body struggling to carry a child that it wasn't developed enough to bear safely. The birth nearly killed her, leaving her permanently damaged and unable to have more children. But she had served her purpose by producing a son, the future Henry VII, and her suffering was considered a small price for dynastic continuity. Or examine the case of Caterina Sforza, married at 10 to Girolamo Riario, a man whose sexual appetites were notorious even by the standards of Renaissance Italy. Historical records note that Caterina required medical attention after the wedding night, though details remain scarce. Ceremonial practices were followed to confirm the marriage, reflecting traditions more than individual experience. She required weeks of recovery, with physicians noting complications that were discreetly documented. These marriages were public spectacles that celebrated private horrors. The grander the ceremony, the more it served to mask the fundamental violence of forcing children into sexual relationships with adult men. Thousands would gather to witness the exchange of vows, to admire the magnificent dresses and jewels, to feast at elaborate banquets. But when the public celebration ended and the bedchamber doors closed, these child brides faced ordeals that would traumatize grown women, let alone girls who still played with dolls in their private moments. The complicity of religious institutions in these arrangements cannot be overstated. Priests who preached about the sanctity of marriage routinely blessed unions that were nothing more than sanctioned child abuse. They spoke of wifely duty and submission while ignoring the cries for help that echoed through palace walls. They threatened eternal damnation for women who refused their husbands while remaining silent about husbands who brutalized their wives. The case of Lucrezia Borgia illustrates how these royal marriages could destroy a woman's life multiple times over. First married at 13 to Giovanni Sforza, she was essentially sold by her father, Pope Alexander VI, to secure a political alliance. When that alliance became inconvenient, her father had the marriage annulled on grounds of non-consummation, a claim that required Lucrezia to undergo humiliating physical examinations to prove. Her virginity had been maintained despite years of marriage. She was immediately remarried to Alfonso of Aragon in a ceremony that mocked her agency even more thoroughly than the first. This second husband was murdered by her brother Cesare when political winds shifted again, leaving Lucrezia a widow at 17. Her third marriage, to Alfonso d'Este, was negotiated while she was still in mourning, her preferences considered so irrelevant that the contracts were signed before she was even informed of her new fate. Each of these weddings was celebrated with appropriate pomp, as if the ceremony itself could wash away the violence inherent in trading women like diplomatic currency. Poets composed verses celebrating Lucrezia's beauty and virtue while ignoring her complete lack of choice in any aspect of her life. Artists painted her portrait in wedding finery, capturing the magnificent gowns but not the despair in her eyes. The physical toll of these marriages extended beyond the immediate violence of wedding nights and forced consummations. Young brides faced repeated pregnancies that their bodies weren't mature enough to handle safely. They endured sexually transmitted diseases passed on by husbands who viewed fidelity as optional for men but mandatory for women. They suffered from complications of childbirth made worse by their youth and the primitive medical care available to them. Isabella of Valois, married to Richard II of England at age 6, was kept at the English court as a child hostage dressed up as a queen. Though the marriage remained unconsummated due to her extreme youth, she lived in constant fear of when her husband would decide she was old enough for the marriage bed. Court records describe a child who gradually stopped eating, stopped playing, stopped speaking unless directly commanded. She existed in a state of suspended terror, waiting for the inevitable night when her childhood would end. When Richard was deposed and murdered, Isabella might have felt relief, but instead she faced new horrors. The new king, Henry IV, immediately began negotiating her remarriage, viewing her as a valuable asset to be redeployed. At 9 years old, she had already been a wife, a widow, and was being prepared to be a wife again, her entire existence reduced to her political value and reproductive potential. The damage these marriages inflicted went beyond individual suffering to poison entire royal bloodlines. Generations of women forced to bear children too young passed on physical and psychological trauma that manifested in their offspring. The high rates of infant mortality, physical deformity, and mental illness in royal families weren't just the result of inbreeding, but also of systemic abuse that damaged mothers before and during pregnancy. Margaret of Anjou, married to Henry VI of England, endured not only a husband who suffered from severe mental illness, but also the pressure to produce an heir while managing a kingdom descending into civil war. Her wedding, a grand affair meant to celebrate peace between England and France, became the prelude to decades of suffering. She faced the impossible task of being both queen and nurse to a husband who alternated between catatonic states and violent outbursts. The wedding night itself was a disaster that set the tone for their entire marriage. Henry, in the grip of one of his episodes, didn't recognize his bride and had to be held back from attacking her. Margaret spent her wedding night barricaded in an antechamber while physicians sedated her husband. The magnificent wedding dress she had worn hours earlier was torn in the struggle, its pearls scattered across the floor like tears. But even functional royal marriages carry their own forms of horror. Catherine of Aragon, married first to Arthur Tudor and then to his brother Henry VIII, endured 6 pregnancies that resulted in only 1 surviving child. Each miscarriage and stillbirth was treated as a personal failure, proof that she had somehow displeased God or failed in her wifely duties. The psychological torture of repeated loss was compounded by the knowledge that her entire value as queen depended on her ability to produce a male heir. Her wedding to Henry VIII had been celebrated as a love match, a rare example of royal marriage based on mutual affection. But that affection curdled into resentment as Catherine's pregnancies failed. The man who had written love songs for her became the architect of her destruction, eventually discarding her through an annulment that made a mockery of the vows they had exchanged with such apparent joy. The pattern repeated across Europe with nauseating consistency. Young girls delivered to older men, magnificent ceremonies masking fundamental violence, wedding nights that were exercises in trauma, marriages that became prisons decorated with silk and jewels. Each story, unique in its details but identical in its basic structure. Female lives sacrificed for male ambition, individual suffering subsumed into political calculation. Anne of Cleves, married to Henry VIII in a ceremony she could barely understand due to language barriers, discovered on her wedding night that her husband found her physically repulsive. The humiliation of being rejected by a man she had been forced to marry was compounded by the public nature of that rejection. The entire court knew that the king had failed to consummate the marriage, that he complained about her appearance, that he was already seeking ways to dispose of her. The annulment that followed was perhaps the best outcome Anne could have hoped for, freeing her from a marriage that would likely have ended with her execution like others before her. But the damage to her reputation and self-worth was permanent. She lived the rest of her life in England, a discarded queen who served as a living reminder of how disposable royal brides truly were. These weddings gone wrong weren't anomalies or exceptional cases. They were the norm in a system that viewed marriage as a political tool and women as the means to wield it. The ceremonies might be beautiful, the gowns magnificent, the celebrations elaborate, but they couldn't disguise the fundamental horror of what was being celebrated, the transfer of ownership of a human being from one man to another, often with devastating consequences for the person being transferred. The tradition reached perhaps its most grotesque expression in the marriage practices of the Ottoman Empire, where foreign princesses were routinely sent as tribute to cement alliances. These girls, some as young as 6 or 7, were married to sultans who already had extensive harems. They faced not only the trauma of child marriage, but also the deadly politics of the harem, where rival wives might poison or strangle competitors and their children. Maria Paleologina, a Byzantine princess sent to the Ottoman court, survived her wedding night only to face decades of imprisonment in the harem. Her letters, smuggled out through sympathetic servants, describe a life of constant fear, forced submission, and the unique horror of watching her own children raised as Muslims while she was forbidden from teaching them about their Greek heritage. Her wedding had been meant to secure peace between Byzantium and the Ottomans. Instead, it secured only her personal destruction. As we reach the modern era, it's tempting to believe these horrors are safely confined to history. But the same forces that created these tragic royal weddings continue to operate in different forms. Young girls are still traded in marriage for family advantage, still forced into relationships with men who view them as property, still celebrated in ceremonies that mask fundamental violations of human rights. The royal weddings we celebrate today with such enthusiasm carry echoes of these historical horrors. When we admire the dress and flowers, we should remember the generations of royal brides who wore similar finery to their own destruction. When we speak of fairy tale weddings, we should acknowledge that many fairy tales are horror stories with better marketing. Today's child marriages in various parts of the world follow the same pattern established by these royal precedents. A girl is deemed ready for marriage not based on her emotional or physical maturity, but on her value as a commodity. Ceremonies are held that celebrate the transfer of ownership while ignoring the terror of the child being transferred. Religious and cultural authorities bless arrangements that they know will result in suffering but consider acceptable for maintaining social order. The damage inflicted by these marriages ripples through generations. Daughters learn that their value lies in their marriageability, that their bodies are currency in transactions between men. Sons learn that women exist to be traded and used, that consent is a luxury rather than a requirement. Entire societies build their stability on the foundation of female suffering, just as European kingdoms once built their alliances on the bodies of sacrificed princesses. Modern human trafficking often uses the language of marriage to disguise its operations. Young girls are promised husbands in wealthy countries, told they'll have wedding ceremonies and stable homes. Instead, they find themselves in situations indistinguishable from historical royal marriages, owned by men who paid for them, subjected to sexual violence disguised as marital duty, prevented from escaping by physical and legal barriers. The wedding industry itself, worth billions globally, trades on fantasies that obscure these historical realities. Every bride is told she's a princess on her wedding day, but we don't talk about what being a princess actually meant for most of history. We celebrate the aesthetic of royal weddings while ignoring the suffering they so often represented. Even in developed nations with legal protections against child marriage, we see echoes of these historical patterns. Young women pressured into marriages for family honor, religious obligation, or economic necessity. Elaborate ceremonies that celebrate unions where consent is theoretical rather than actual. Wedding nights that become exercises in coercion rather than celebration. The stories of Agnes of France, Margaret Beaufort, Lucrezia Borgia, and countless others aren't just historical curiosities. They're warnings about what happens when we prioritize political expediency over human dignity, when we allow tradition to excuse trauma, when we celebrate ceremonies that sanctify suffering. Their weddings, dressed up in silk and ceremony, were crime scenes decorated to look like celebrations. We owe it to these forgotten victims to remember their stories not as romantic tragedies, but as preventable horrors. Every child bride forced into marriage today joins a historical procession of girls whose lives were stolen by systems that valued their political worth over their human rights. Every wedding that celebrates coercion rather than consent adds another chapter to this ongoing story of sanctioned abuse. They weren't brides. They were hostages in silk, sacrificed for politics, and hidden behind wedding veils. We don't honor them with flowers, we honor them by refusing to repeat the ceremony.